All right. Morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute or two for others to arrive. I see some folks are coming in, and then we'll kick it off. So just be patient for just one more minute. Okay, let's get started. And as more people join, they can just jump right in. Let me turn on my camera. All right. Welcome, everyone, to Wednesday morning. Hot topic, risk versus issues, something near and dear to my heart because I've been through this for many, many years. And I thought that this would be a great topic to really discuss because it comes up so much in our jobs as risk practitioners. And I wanted to break this down and give some best practices. Let's talk about what the experts say. Let's give some examples and go through this to try to put some structure around it, some basic rules. But first, let me do a little bit introduction. So I'm Phil Aldrich. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Verterim. I also teach governance risk compliance at Boston College for their graduate program. And previously, I did 12 years at Dell EMC, where I was in charge of enterprise GRC and enterprise risk management. Now, for the agenda, I'm going to keep it pretty simple, right? We're going to talk about why is there just so much confusion, around risk and issues. And then we're going to look at a variety of different authoritative sources, ISO, COSO, and Basel, and others, and see what they say around the distinguish between what a risk is and an issue. We're going to break down risk and issues, and we can't leave this discussion without talking about threats and vulnerabilities. My background started in cybersecurity, so threats and vulnerabilities along with risk and issues, and what's the relationship between all of them, and see where we can see similarities and alignment, because these four terms absolutely get confused, all the time. Now, before we get into the content, we'll be using the chat for any interaction. If you have any questions, comments, a story, so we'll be monitoring that also. We also have some poll questions, so we'll pick a few. We have a couple slides that we'll stop and just do some quick polls to just, see where everyone is at in terms of, how, the problems that they're dealing with, or, their stage of implementation of risks or issues. So in your interface, just keep an eye in the chat, and then when we stop the polls, look out for that. All right. So I expect to get this, wrapped up within, between 30 to 40 minutes. It depends on, the questions as we go through that. All right. So first is, why is there just so much confusion in the terminology? And, through the years, I'd always hear, Phil, I found a risk, or I just mitigated this risk. And I'd have to say 99% of the time, when I hear these statements, I just let it go. Because I know what they mean, and I wouldn't correct in terms of, from an academic standpoint or how they're thinking about it, what it is. I would correct as we would do enterprise risk management discussions with first line of defense or second line of defense teams. I might break it down, but for, a risk practitioner, like me, it is a little bit, nails on the chalkboard a little bit, because these often get confused, and I can absolutely see why, because it is a chicken and the egg approach. And so it's absolutely understandable that, issues and risks and vulnerabilities and threats, it's all interchangeable. And so for the most part, I let it go. But, when I hear, hey, I just found, a new risk, in my mind, I'm like, oh, hey, you find an issue, but you identify a new risk, right? And even though those terms are very close, they are different. And when we talk about the process, it becomes more apparent. And can you mitigate a risk? Yes, you can mitigate a risk. Can you mitigate risk to zero? Yes, you can. It doesn't often happen, because there is, a likelihood, and it goes down to, 0%. But these, are more exceptions than what you see. And just to throw it out there, can an issue be a risk? Yes, an issue can be a risk in some circumstances, and we'll talk about we'll talk about that. But it doesn't happen that often. But yes, it can be, an issue can be a risk. It just depends on the context, the relate, and the risk interaction of that. All right. So next, let's just talk about, all right, what do the experts say around risks? And it starts with, risk taxonomy. COSO, ISO, and Basel are, some of the core authoritative sources, on risk. And there is commonality around this. And risk is defined in terms of uncertainty. And that's key, because it means that, hey, this could happen. It's not known. It's not 100%. It's at going to happen, but this has a possibility to have it. So it is about uncertainty, possibility. And COSO, ISO, and Basel. Now Basel looks at it more, operational risk, is that, hey, we don't really know, but we want to go through and analyze if this particular event might happen. And for a risk, it's mostly talked about in terms of, an event. But it's about a possibility. So it's not 100% set in stone, but risk, yeah, you could have a risk with 100% likelihood, but that doesn't happen. Sometimes it does, right? Where there's always outliers where risks have like a very high velocity. It comes into our face. The pandemic, COVID pandemic, is a great example of it, where it really wasn't on a lot of people's radar. Very high velocity. It means it came in very, very fast, and yeah, 100%, and we were automatically in it. So there are some times where, right, we jump right into that risk, but it's a lot of times it's those high velocity risks. But just keep an eye that there is a commonality between COSO, ISO 31000, and Basel, is that it's about a possibility and certainty about an event. Now, we're just going to do a quick poll just to get an idea of, where folks are, are at in their sort of risk journey. And I'm just gonna pick one of the question here, and this is a key one, especially for my enterprise risk background, and this is about how risks are governed. And I'm just going to start this right now. And in your organization, do you think about risks holistically and centralize all these various sort of risk events into one central risk register? So, just, take 30 seconds or so and, answer that question. And I have a slide about risk registers, but, the two questions that I always get, with executives and what they want to know are what are my top risks and what are we doing about it? Now, to identify what top risks are, it implies that you know what all the potential risks are, and you have to centralize it and put that together. All right, so I'm going to stop that there. It looks like it's split, and it's a key part of of risk management. Now, when we get to issues also should be centralized. Now, they're not quite put into a register, but it's more of a catalog. But this is great. Now, let me just throw another one out here. And do you have a standard process to go through and identify risks and analyze them? Now, typically, the best practice is it's an annual exercise. Now, I know in my past job, it was, and I've had different iterations in different companies where sometimes it was only with the top senior executives, and sometimes it was flexible. It might not have been, every year. And then I've been with, other organizations where it's every year, the same time, and you interview 2 or 3 layers of the leadership. Okay. So again, we have splits in the answers there. All right, terrific. So next, we're going to move on here, and we're going to talk, just as we saw with COSO and that we saw with ISO and Basel, the key here is that a risk is an event that hasn't occurred, that it has a potential to impact, the organization. But we just don't know, about that. And how we identify that is through a risk assessment process. Now, we can see here that we have ISO 31000 and we have COSO. Very similar, but there are differences, around this. Now, with a risk assessment process, there's multiple elements that are within this. And, it differs slightly with ISO 31000 and COSO. We can see with ISO 31000, it starts with establishing the context. And I love this term. And OSEG has the same approach. It all starts with context because context changes. So whenever you do a risk assessment, you have to really understand what has changed, in the environment, internal into the organization, outside of the organization, culture, stakeholders, etc. So I really like the establish the context. But we can see with COSO, they have the risk assessment process with starting after identifying risks, where ISO 31000 has risk identification as a first step as risk assessment. I don't think, it really matters in terms of, how do you define risk assessment? As long as you go through, all the steps, where that dotted line is I don't think, too important. But I do like how ISO thinks about this is, hey, what has changed? And because you have to understand that first before you can get into, all right, if we have some current risks, has anything changed with those? Do we have any new risks? And so you can identify the risks, then you have to have a way to analyze the risk, and then you evaluate it. And that's usually for the prioritization of the risks, right? So every risk may not be equal, because if you have hundreds of risks that you identify, you have to determine a consistent way to analyze it and then prioritize that. So then you can figure out, all right, well, if I have limited resources, how should I treat these risks? Are we mitigating? Are we going to transfer this? Are we going to accept? But what you can see here between ISO and 31000 and COSO, it's very similar, and that there are distinct steps within risks and identifying and treating the risks. Now, there are a variety of ways to do this. I have my preferences, and the risk assessment, and here's just an example. I think this came out of ServiceNow, and using technology to do this process, where you go through identifying a risk, analyzing it, doing the evaluation, that helps you really prioritize it and then figure out, what are we going to do about it? Which ones are we going to mitigate first? I always found the best value with live interviews first, with actually talking to the leaders. Surveys don't get the results that you want, because sometimes when you send out these a survey, something like this, you need background information. And what I've always found with senior leadership, you have to dumb this down, and you got to talk at it in a very basic sense, in terms of what are they thinking about that could happen in that next year. And usually you're looking at this in an annualized view. And they're not going to know any of the enterprise risks, values, and what this means. So leave it out. I try to not even bring anything in when I do a risk assessment with senior leaders. I talk about it in terms of, hey, if we, what are you worried about? What type of events? What could be driving these events? And I try to calibrate them, right? And I calibrate them in terms of, because you have to quantify some of these impacts. And I always start off with, is this a little league problem? High school, college, or major league? I use that a lot. And when you say, well, what's little league, then I'll start to put in some of the impacts, like little league. Hey, depending upon your organization, that might be $1 million, $1 million or lower, right? And I always bracket it with dollars and cents, because every risk impact that's out there, even from if you're looking at it from a reputational or an operational, it does come down to dollars and cents, and the business understands that. So when I approach it, I've always had good feedback when it's just a discussion. I go back through as a risk, as the practitioner owning the risk program, and then I fill out a risk assessment based upon what I heard from the business. That has what I found has worked the best for me, and you get more accurate results, and you can go back and try to calibrate those answers a little bit more if something wasn't clear with it. But technology is very good to kind of have that standardization of the risk assessment process and to go through here. But again, this is from the risks of potential events that you use this process. But there are standard decision-making tools that you have with risks, and you can do some of these with issues, and we're going to talk through where some of the best practices are with this, but you always do this with risks. And what you see here is from COSO, and COSO has some really good documentation, and some of it's free. This is actually coming out from one of their documents that I love, that it came out I think in like 2012 that I still use. I use this for teaching. I use it when I had my previous roles, and it's just a great guide. And you have to have some standardization. And for risks, there are always the core elements here around impact and likelihood. And what I found is keep it simple. Keep it really simple. Now, every industry is different. If you're in insurance or might be financial services, you might be mandated to do it in a very specific way or specific methodology, right? Or cybersecurity you might use a FAIR methodology, but it all comes back to, the impact and likelihood overall, but you might have a different approach for this. But hey, if you're in retail, manufacturing, or a lot of these other industries, I found keeping it simple where you have a standardized impact scale, and you're really looking at it, 4 or 5 different sort of, impact designations, and every company can be different. Right? You can cater to this now, and you have different examples because the business likes this, especially when you're talking to them and you're trying to calibrate impacts of various events, is that you have, different flavors and examples within this. So you can see here from incidental to extreme on an impact scale, for a risk, you have an example of like, hey, a financial loss between here and here, or there's some brand impact. So you can see, going from local media coverage into international, long-term global coverage of a particular, event. Now, one of the questions I always get asked on this is, well, Phil, what if we have, a variety? What if we have a financial loss here, and then we have a reputational loss here? Because you can have a risk event that has multiple types of impacts across the different ratings, within that. And I've seen other organizations, and I've been through this conversation where do we add all this up and try to combine this? And what I found is, as a best practice, is it's not a good idea. Trying to make it into an experiment where you're trying to calculate every single impact across all the various impacts. What I found is easier, works best, is from the business perspective, what are they most concerned about? Is it a specific financial loss? Is it about resiliency, loss of operations? Is it around brand? And try to equate that to, all right, so if we did get, local media coverage, hey, that might be a lower type of overall impact because maybe it impacts, our customers locally versus, globally, because it does align to dollars and cents. And also, if you're looking at it, from that particular area, you can align the likelihood of that. I've had many risk events that have been exactly identified by different business teams out there, but they look at it differently. They have the same one, but one team is looking at it in terms of like a huge red herring event with very extreme financial, or overall impact to the organization, but it's very low likelihood that that's going to happen. Where I've had another team look at a very similar type of event, but they're looking at it, hey, this is happening constantly, but it has very low impact overall. And they're both right. They're both right. And I've had that discussion a lot, is that, you have to listen to the business and look at it from their different perspectives of it. Some look at it as a huge type of impact, but less likely some are looking at the bleeding types of events that are there that happen on a daily or weekly basis. And they're both right. They're both right. Now, as they look at that risk event itself and the criticality, it might have different sort of criticality as you look at impact and times likelihood equals criticality, but they're both right. And you don't want to dissuade that, hey, we're just going to look at it this way. It's always good to get all the business perspective, from that. And in terms of, measurement techniques, if you are not in one of those industries I talked about, insurance, financial services, or others where you might have a very quantitative framework that you're going to use, I found that qualitative works best. Now, it does come back to business always says, when you show them their risks, how do we get here, right? And so it's more of a subjective approach to that. Now, subjective approaches where it's kind of like a ballpark does have a lot of value because it does get you the right prioritization of your risks. However, it's a lot harder to go against that and say, well, here's the data that supports it. But there are risks management actions, such as if you look at risks that have actually happened, that have been realized. And this is one of those examples where a risk can be 100%. So you're looking back the last year and you're doing a loss event analysis. So you're saying, all right, last year we had these events that maybe we were tracking before that had maybe a 75% chance of happening, actually happened last year. We could take the pandemic. What was our losses for that risk? And that is a really good exercise in risk management because it gives you a baseline of an actual event that happened in the organization that you can then use when you do your risk assessment process the next year, because the business always remembers what has happened in the past. So having a loss event program is part of risk management. It's part of risks. You don't do it as much as part of the issues. And it's very good for calibrating and figuring out, okay, there's a little bit of a qualitative, answer for that. Now, some of the other best practices, so this is decision-making criteria tools to standardize. But we also have to look at it as organization. Risks go into a register. Issues, you might call it a register, but I see it more of a catalog of issues. And when we get to the issues management, we'll discuss that. But risks absolutely go into register. There is a hierarchy to them. So if we look on the right, you might have your very high level enterprise risks. So it's going to be very few in number. These might be the risks that are talked about and discussed in the 10K. And then as you go down in your risk register, you go from very large categories like enterprise risk, and then you start going down even all the way down to control level, more tactical, more operational risks, where the scope is a lot more defined. And what this helps is that it not only organizes your risks, but it organizes all the other elements that might be aligned to the risks. And you might align controls, your issues, your exceptions, your remediation plans, programs, risk programs at different levels, right? And it depends on the organization, of that. And also you might do an evaluation of one level in your risk register. I know in the past, if I had 5 levels of risk, most of the strategic analysis was done at risk level 2 from an enterprise risk standpoint. But from a business standpoint, they were looking at the 3rd level of risk. So it depends on the organization and how that you want to structure this, but risks have a hierarchy. And you can see here on the left, this is an example from Archer. And, there's going to be some consistent metadata that you're going to have in a risk register. You're going to have an overall risk name. Now that risk name should be, pretty short. And then you can have a more detailed information in the description. You can see there it's aligned to, in Archer speak, an intermediate risk. So that's the next level up. So if this is like a level 3 type risk, this would be, the intermediate risk might be a level 2 type of risk. And you can have other ones like, well, who's accountable for this? Do we have, an overall business sponsor for it? Do we, who are the operational managers? And it differs. It differs for each company. Best practices don't go crazy on this. Try to keep it simple and have the right metadata around your risk. Now, you might, at different levels of the risk, you might have more information around that. You might do calculations and roll-ups at different levels of risk. I know what I like to do is that I would have all the business risks at like a level 3 of the risks. But I'd roll it up into the next level up, which would be level 2, which I would be looking at for ERM. So that means I would look across all the organization, and I look across, all the average impacts, the likelihoods, and any other type of metadata or metrics I would have, and I'd roll it up at that higher level risk category that might be just below like an enterprise, the big bucket risk, but it was more workable at a smaller category that I could think about from an enterprise ERM view. Now, the other thing with a risk register is that it's meant to be kind of encompassing. Even though you might not have a business risk out there, think of it as kind of, I like to always use this like a Netflix, right? And Netflix has all those various categories. You have horror, and then you have, slasher horror, and then you have like, clown slasher horror, right? There's a hierarchy, to this. Well, you want to have like a placeholder, even though you might not have any clown slasher movies yet, right? You want to have a placeholder for that category. Same for like the business. You want to just think about, okay, what are the potential risk events, in those basic categories that you'd have there. So when you go through your risk assessment process, that you can align it, to that risk category. If you don't have it, it's fine. So if you identify a business risk and you're like, I don't know where to map this. Should it go here? Should it go here? It just might mean that you just might not have a risk in your hierarchy, right? That higher level risk category, maybe from an ERM perspective, that you want to align it to. And that is natural because that helps grow that risk register. There is one mistake that I do see is that you do not want to build a risk register based upon your company organization. Deloitte always refers this as an organizational trap for when you build a risk register, even though it just seems natural and sometimes when you build the risk register out, it kind of flows into sometimes organizationally, and that's okay, but you never want to do that. And the reason being is that while sometimes it seems natural because you have the accountability all right there, is that if we know anything about the organization, it changes and accountability changes. So you want to keep the risk register as agnostic as possible as you build it out, by the different layers there. Okay. Now, once you have a risk register and you know how to do a risk, you're doing a risk assessment, you identified your risk, you used your analysis tools. This is a pretty standard reporting deliverable, and that is a heat map. And love it or hate it, it really works. And there are a lot of flexibility that you can do with a heat map. But one, it's very visual. So you can start to see like, okay, what's in the top right quadrant. You can add multiple layers to this. So if you look at this as an example from COSO, so you have impact, you have likelihood. Now, vulnerability is one thing that COSO has. That's more from a cyber risk standpoint. And mostly cyber teams use that. From an enterprise risk, I've never used it, the vulnerability. But speed of onset, that is velocity. And I love velocity because sometimes you have risks that have the same criticality score. Now, they might be different impact and likelihood, but overall, when you do the calculations, it's sometimes, yeah, you have ties. And I like to use velocity, meaning that if a risk is moving faster, right, and coming in really fast, that an organization might not be prepared. They may not have the controls in place, the programs, or that attention yet. And so that helps prioritize those potential risk events. And the other thing I like about heat maps too is that you can mess around this, right? You can, have a bigger bubble, and then you can kind of link this to issues. And when we talk about issues can be great indicators of risks. So if you have 400 issues around that is aligned by potential one risk event, that's a great indicator. And you can use bubble size. So I like the bubble sizes. Also, you can have the roll up of risks, lower level risks, into the higher level risk categories. So it gives you a little bit more context. And so you can start answering the mail, like what are our top risks and why, so you can have it visually and you can have the list that's here. So I found this very, very helpful. And also to have a standardized heat map for all the elements of the business, so it's consistent. And then you can roll it up into an enterprise type heat map. So a heat map is a very good one. The other one is a risk scorecard. And risk scorecards support the heat map as well, but it gives a little bit more metadata. You can also put a little bit of information and context around preparedness, right? In terms of, hey, what's the management intention here? Do we have controls or programs around it? So I like to use both. Also, adding in key risk indicators for measurements of your risks is kind of standardized between a heat map and having a risk profile overall that has your risk profiles, but also you could do a singular profile around a particular risk at a certain level. And what this is good about is you can say, all right, say we have one uncertainty about, resiliency in, a particular country because of climate change, right? And the organization has a lot of facilities there, et cetera. You could put a profile all around that particular risk that brings in all the other information. It might link in potential issues. It might say, well, what are all the high value assets that are around it? It might bring in other type of control information or testing information and metrics. So having a scorecard or profile around your risks that you have, or an individual risk, is a good idea. And I would say that, the heat map and having this type of scorecard is pretty standard for enterprise risk management. And I enjoyed that when I managed the program, because you got to summarize it, you got to make it very easy for the business as well. And if you have data in the back to support this, it's always good to have, because executives always ask for it. And that's where you get into key risk indicators and metrics that can have those direct measurements. And that's what risks have versus issues. Issues can be part of that metric discussion, but risks have heat maps. Risks have scorecards. Risks have indicators and measurements that are around that. All right. So now that's about risk. We're going to just go through issues real fast, and I'm going to pick one here for issues. So for issues, let's see. Let's pick. Yeah. Oh, here's a good one. All right. So if you're managing issues, do you have consistency of what an issue criticality is? I found this to be very difficult, and it is tough. And I've seen different approaches to this. We're gonna talk about that, but yeah, it's very hard to have that consistency with issues, because issues have a very broad interpretation, for that. And so what I'm going to do here is we're just going to say, what is an issue? And let's just keep it basic. An issue is an identified or a known finding, gap, deficiency, weakness, whatever you want to call it, is that, hey, we know about it, right? The egg is broken and it is in the present tense. Now, we compare this to risks, and risks are often referred to in the future, right? It's that uncertainty. Issues is, hey, we got a problem. We found something. And I would say typically issues are more tactical or granular in nature. So, but what's interesting is that COSO, ISO, etc., don't really define issues that well, even though it's a core element of risk management. And I always found that, very interesting that it's really not brought up or there's no deep dive into, what an issue or a finding or a gap is as it relates to, a risk. But what we could see here is that risk is more about future, issues are present tense. But I did find, right, and I like this, and I modified it a little bit, but, the Project Management Institute, right, thinks very highly of issues. And, this is, how they think about it. And, I liked it. And I tweaked it just a little bit. But one, issues are about, hey, since we know about it, we need to make this visible. And we need to contain it, right? It might be an issue, an incident that is happening, right? You're stopping the bleeding. And for an issue, you're thinking about, hey, since we know this, that we have to have some sort of treatment, right, of that issue. And it might be mitigation. Most of the time it's mitigation, right? If there is where the business is accepting, like, we don't have the money for this, and this happens, right? Then you might have an exception process that's linked to that issue, but it's about accountability. A lot of times it goes back to the business. For risks, there could be accountability there, but what I found is that accountability is more at the higher level to look holistically around a large risk category so they can see what's there. There is more tactical ownership at the issue level. But both need accountability. But I see issues is that, hey, this has got to be prerequisite. Someone's got to own this. We found this. I've seen before where, hey, all these issues or findings have been found and they just sit there. And that's very common, right, in itself. And you need to think about, well, how can this be automated, right? And this is where risk management helps, where if you can align an issue to a risk, and that risk, a higher level risk, has an owner, you can start looking at, auto assigning some of those issues. Like if you're finding that you can't find anyone for those issues. The other thing that I brought up before is issues are great if you're able to align it. So you have this one issue and you align it to a risk. If I have one risk that have 400 open issues aligned to it, I'm going to raise up the likelihood of that risk event happening, right? So you see this relationship. Issues, present tense, we know that something is going on. We found it, right? Now, issue severity, everything is, can be hard. I have found keeping it simple works best than going through some sort of scientific experiment for every single issue. But it depends on your organization. I've seen organizations go through that, but it's a smaller number of findings. They look at more of the most critical ones that are there. But easiest works best because it's easier to implement, faster to implement it. And if you keep it simple, it's a lot easier to explain to senior management. But issues can be a really great measurement for risks. Now, some of the elements that's different, around issues management. Now we're looking at it from an archer is that, hey, there's an architecture for this. So when we think of issues, and I call it findings in Archer, it's different for different tools, but they mean the same thing, is context around this and linking this together is it's best practice. So you can see here as part of the GRC architecture, you have findings, right? What level the hierarchy in the organization it might be to, findings folder is an Archer specific, but basically it's kind of almost like as we think about risk register, it's okay, what are just the categories of findings? Right? It might not be, in a hierarchy, but let's just put it in, the big overall buckets. And we talked about if the business can't do anything with it, then you might have an exception request. Again, accountability to the business specifically for an issue. And that is the best practice, is having an exception request process, right? And this can be linked again to remediation plans. So you might have a remediation plan that remediates multiple different findings. And then all this can be linked to, controls, your policies. So there's a little ecosystem here for issues that you need to think about. If you document your issues, that's there. And it's a little bit different in the technologies of how they approach it, but alignment is key, because otherwise you just have this big bucket of issues without additional context. So the more that you're able to align, specifically if you can align those issues to the potential risk events, it's powerful. The data becomes a lot more meaningful from an overall risk management and issues management when you put it together. Now, I like to say, issues is kind of top, the top down going up, and risks are, top down. It depends. I'd say generally that's true, because when you have an issue, it's kind of a known sort of tactical thing that you found. That is known within the organization. Now, it brings me to the next part, and this is why you always have this confusion, is that there's a cycle to this. Because, if you are identifying some issues, it might naturally, it goes, well, what could happen based upon this? Now, an issue might be so low level, right? It may not cause this huge, catastrophe within the organization, this big event, but it raises that awareness. So you might identify a lot of issues that are there, especially like recurring issues, and you might say, you know what? We have no risk event that is related to this. So maybe we need to add a risk that's there. And because we're finding all these issues within the company, that might increase the likelihood, right, of this particular risk event. So again, it's a good indicator. If you have all these issues, but you can't, in your current risk register, you can't map it to anything, then, hey, we might need a new risk, that's there. And right, in the impact and likelihood of a risk can be influenced, right, by those issues. Now, different GRC platforms, I'm just going to look at, issues management, and this is in ServiceNow. If you can see this, there are, common elements as we look at, issues. And, this is an example here. An issue that, hey, we know there's no disaster recovery plan for SAP accounting, right? It's known. We looked, and you didn't have anything, right? And it could be, it's not defined, and therefore you're not testing it. And we could see there, you have like an overview of metadata around that issue. And then, you link it to potential remediation tasks. There might be SLAs to that. You'll link it to issues. You might have some indicators, right? Similar to key risk indicators that you see around risks, but it just might be a little bit more basic that you have. And then if you have an issue, you might link it to a control, right? Because it might be part of testing, that's there. You might link it to, a policy. So there are some standard elements that you want to ensure that you have, for managing issues. But some of the problem is you want to have a standardized way of bringing all your issues together. And it gets complicated when you start adding 10, 20, 30, 40 different risk practitioner teams all managing your issues together. And again, the advice is, try to keep it simple. It's hard to bring all of, the cats together for that. So, there are elements there that, you need to think about, for issues. And some of it is culturally to kind of bring it all together. The other part is consistency. Consistency is key, whether it's for risks or, for issues. And these GRC platforms, they help you, bring that type of discipline there. And then, if we look at risk management, again, risks have certain types of metadata, right? That's different from issues, right? And most of the time you are doing some sort of analysis with impact and likelihood. Some risks you might do an inherent, right? So if you're looking at risk, what's the potential inherent risks if we don't know if there's any controls there? And you might have one rating, and then you look at it from residual. I think for the most part, if you're not in some of these industries that have specific requirements, you'll keep it very simple. I know that when I did this, it was mostly from a residual standpoint. So based on what we know in the control environment and what is working and what is not working, what do we think is potential, impact and likelihood? And if we have data to support it, fantastic. But we can see here that, within risks, you're linking it to your assessments, your controls, right? Metric definitions and metrics, that's your key risk indicators, and then issues, right? So there's that linkage. So best practices, make sure if you have your issues and your risks that you're linking those together. Now, if we bring this together in comparison of like risks and issues, and this is what I always refer to when, I have the discussions with first or second line, is if it's a risk, right, we're thinking in the future. If it's an issue, it's present, it's present tense. We know that it's here. It's a known deficiency. Organization of risk, it goes into a risk register. You might have multiple levels where the top is going to be your enterprise risk, and it might go all the way down to potential control level risk. And then for issues, organization, the best practice is that you're aligning it to risk. Yeah, you might put we saw in Archer, you might put it into a folder that puts it into a broad category. But the best organization for issues is aligning it to your risks in your risk register. Now for analysis, the cores, you do an impact and likelihood. Issues, I've seen some of this work and some of it, the analysis piece, in terms of severity, different. If you have thousands and thousands of issues, does it make sense that you're going to go through every single issue and do an impact and likelihood of it? I've seen this attempted, and it doesn't work if you have a lot of issues like that. If you're just doing a smaller subset and you want to have some consistently like you have with risks, then yes, go ahead. If you have some automation, right, of where that issue was found, that you can put it into a low, medium, or high category, go for it, right? If it works. But I've seen it fail if you try to take too much of an approach that every single issue needs to go through a severity analysis. So it really depends on your organization. So you need to think about that, because if you have enough people that can go through it, then great. You're going to get really good information that then can help align to your risks and then help calibrate your likelihood and potential impact there. But if you don't, then what you're going to end up with is, a lot of issues that don't have, severity scores, and they should have it. And then you're not going to do the things that you need to do, which is, I think, most important, is aligning it to your risks. And if we're reporting, like I said, standardized risks get reported in a heat map or some type of scorecard, which includes a profile. Issues, it can be a variety. They can be a part of the heat map. They're mostly, brought in together in terms of where they're aligned, in the business, or maybe a category. It's more for sort of tactical reporting, but you look at it holistically all together. The best reporting that I see with issues is, again, as it relates to the risks. Now, we only have a few minutes here. Now I want to just leave if there's any questions that we can't leave it without talking about vulnerability. I have a cyber background and vulnerability comes up, and I'm just going to keep it simple. Vulnerability is we found something. Now think about your vulnerability scans that go on, in your infrastructure environment there. That means it scans. It has found something. It means that you're not on the right patch. It could be something around the port. It could be, a variety of elements there, but it means something was found. We know it and we can point to it. So therefore, it is a known weakness or gap, right? So very similar to issues. Whereas threat is, again, more potential, right? You might have threat intelligence to go into almost like a threat register. I've seen that with cyber teams, but it's about the potential, right? So the emphasis is about potential. It's an uncertainty, but you can link vulnerabilities, right, based upon the known threats, right? There's a linkage there. And we put this all together, right? We start to see some alignment between issues of vulnerability and risk and threats. And I put some examples, that are there. And, for issues and vulnerability, right, it's something that was found. We know about it. And for risks and threats, this is the potential to occur, and it's talked about in future tense. Now, that is the general rule. Now, again, I talked about sort of the chicken and the egg. There are some times where an issue can then turn into, a risk and vice versa. There's this whole concept of risk interaction, where if you have one risk, which is really a driver for the next risk, so think of like dominoes that fall, and it could be like, hey, you realize one risk all of a sudden became 100%, and therefore is tipping it against and influencing another risk event, and for the likelihood to go up. So there are examples where risks and issues can be the same, because there is that relationship there. But for the most part, if you're confused or if you're trying to talk about it, an issue is something that is found, right? And it's realized, and a risk and a threat is the potential to occur. Now, yes, it could be 100% likelihood, and therefore it is, right? And that's why there is some of that, the flexibility there. But for the most part, you're doing an evaluation for understanding what is that potential likelihood or impact to the organization. So hopefully this clears this up a little bit. These terms get used interchangeably, all the time. But when I discuss this, I'm always thinking, hey, if you found a risk, you're really thinking about you found an issue, and you mitigate, an issue. You don't mitigate a risk. You try to reduce, the impact, or likelihood, around that. Now, some of that's just a little bit of, terminology from with my ERM hat on, but hope this helps with understanding, the differences between these four. And I'll stop right here because I think we're just about at time, and see if there are any questions in the chat. All right. All right. Hey, well, thank you all very much for attending. And hey, if anything comes up, feel free to reach out to me. And, I love this stuff, love talking about it, and hope to see you again on another future webinar. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.